So Kevin, thank you so much for speaking to us about your book, School
Pleasure.
as a Secure Base, and also why you wrote it. So perhaps you could start off just by telling us a bit about your background as a teacher and other influences that has led you to want to write this book.
Of course, yes. I've been a teacher for almost as long as I can remember, and very much enjoy the teaching process, the contact with children, and the fun that we can have together. I've been through a number of schools in a number of positions, ending up as a head of creative arts faculty, and that was quite challenging, but also very rewarding. After a short pause, then I moved to working more exclusively with looked after children and supporting their education, and that led to a whole new range of experiences for me that started to make me look more at the way that children learn, the way that children react to life situations. And it brought me into contact with other professionals, social workers, support workers, doctors, psychologists, and so on. And out of all of this, I decided that it was time to start to distill some of this, because I felt increasingly that the teacher is so much central to the success of a child in the classroom. That almost goes without saying, but can be overlooked. And we need equipping with the right information about children, how they learn, and especially my experience then with looked after children, how trauma and attachment issues impacted so virulently on their learning and on their abilities just to cope in life. So that led me to think, well, how can I bring this together? And it resulted basically in the book that we've now got before us, School as a Secure Base, how peaceful teachers can create peaceful schools.
Yeah, so that concept of peace is really important to you, isn't it? Just tell me tell me just about peace in general for you, Kevin. What's inspired you to put that as such a central concept in this book?
I think peace is something which is a positive. It's not the absence of anything. It is how one can react to life situations in a way that remains positive and life enhancing. And if one can inculcate a sense of peace within oneself by a variety of methods, then you stand a good chance, I stand a good chance, of being able to react positively to whatever is thrown at me. And so peace for me is very much a positive, ongoing virtue, I suppose, is the word I could use.
How do you practice it for yourself, if you do? Or do you have any practices that support you in your search for peace?
There's a number of practices, yes. My own influences are, I suppose, people like Viktor Frankl and Man's Search for Meaning, when he makes comments about how we can come to a sense of peace, come to a sense of inner still before we react to life's influences. Writers such as Eckhart Tolle, who writes about the power of now, of being totally in the present and not being influenced too much by life's baggage or thrown into a sense of hopeless anxiety about an uncertain future. And also writers such as Rudolf Steiner and his ideas concerning the importance of the human being and how human beings can react to their environment.
And are these things that have that you're hoping that the peaceful teacher will be able to imbibe in some way, not necessarily by writing specifically about them, but something of that ambience of the importance of this moment in terms of what you're able to do with the children in the class, or this sense of how do we collectively make meaning together? Is that one of the driving principles for you?
Yes, very much so. The fact that as a teacher, I can react to children out of my own background, I can react to children out of my own anxieties, or I can react to children out of a sense of, I am the adult, I can control a situation in a positive way. You are the child, you are still processing life or coming to terms with life. And if somehow I can bring myself into a state of self-observation which is positive, then I think I'm in a stronger position to help that child come to terms with whatever they have brought with them on that particular day in that particular moment.
So your piece effectively is in service of the child finding their own.
It's both. I think it will help the child, but it also helps me to react in a way that is positive and not going to wind me up and therefore wind up the child. These children know which buttons to press if they can find them. And I've been as guilty as anybody else of having pressed buttons and reactions in a certain way. But we won't go into that. I think, though, that increasingly I'm in a stronger position now than I was, say, even when I started teaching.
So yes, if you look back to that original Kevin, if we just as a biographical note for the moment, if we look back to that original Kevin, what would you say to him as this person who is working constantly on finding more peace for yourself, writing about it as a way of advocating it for teachers to be able to be more grounded and more present, drawing on all these influences? What would you say to that young Kevin starting out now? Younger Kevin,
yes. I would say don't take it personally, Kevin.
Okay.
For goodness sake, this child has just called you every name under the sun, not because they know anything about you, not because they hate you, but because you happen to be that person at that time representing an adult world that the child finds threatening and unpleasant.
Yes, I can't trust,
I can't trust you. And it's up to me then to work with that and to not react out of a position of fear, anxiety myself, and to help steer the child into calmer waters.
Yes, you emphasize in the book, one of the things I was quite struck by was about this capacity, or for teachers to be able to develop their capacity for self-reflection, and for educational staff in general, for us to be able to think and to look at our own processes, but to do that with support as well, not just alone, not just
indeed
to think I've got to do yet another thing on my own. But so would you just like to talk briefly about that, what you're advocating? And I know that you are drawing on some of the experiences that you had working alongside social workers and other disciplines where they have supervision, don't they? Because one of the things that's really lacking for teachers often is that space. So what are the different spaces that you advocate for in the book?
Yes, one of the spaces, certainly, as you mentioned, was the lack of supervision for education workers. And in the absence of that, I strongly advocate the concept of peer mentoring, of finding a colleague in your school or another school, or even a close friend who's not necessarily a teacher, but perhaps will be, with whom you can share, with whom you can talk in a non-judgmental way. You're not expecting your friend to come up with all the answers, but you are able to put into words what might otherwise be a mad circle of thoughts in your head that doesn't go anywhere. So that's one thing. Keeping logs, keeping journals, I know that's a personal thing again, but that can also work. And also being able to create, hopefully in your own school, support groups of like-minded individuals cutting across all disciplines, all departmental boundaries, with whom you can, on a regular basis, talk about individual children, the school situation, education in general, but knowing that you're talking in confidence to a group of people with whom you have a certain rapport and with whom you feel comfortable.
And in the book, one of the things that I really enjoy in the book is the fact that you have a colleague who's an Ofsted inspector who kind of acts as a bit of a devil's advocate and throws difficult questions at you. And one of the things that he challenges you on, which I think is a really fair comment, is, come on, Kevin, it's all very well saying one teacher can make a difference to a school, but actually, don't you need a peaceful head? Because why isn't it that you focused on how heads could generate peace around them? Why are you putting the onus just back on one poor old teacher again?
Yes, well, I wouldn't say a poor old teacher, but I would say that if a school has a sympathetic head, and I have worked with some. If a school has a sympathetic head, then so much else can flow. It doesn't exonerate the teacher from taking responsibility for what goes on between them and their children, but it can very much help things. If, however, you have a head who is not sympathetic, then you have two choices. You can either keel under and say, oh, poor old me, nasty head, nasty senior management team, what can I do? Bother. Or you can say, well, there are chinks of light here. I do have a colleague down the corridor who I know feels the same as me, and we're not just a pair of moaning minutes. We can, in fact, talk about this situation, find ways forward, and start our own little bubble of good practice. And heads change, senior management teams change, the school atmosphere can change almost in a school year. But if you are firmly rooted in your own principles of peacefulness, then you can still continue in a positive way.
Lovely, thank you. So you talked about also in the book about how the peaceful teacher can also really focus on their environment. I notice you're in an environment with all sorts of imagery and so forth on the back. Do you want to tell us about what does environment mean to you? What has it meant as you've been teaching? But also, what are you advocating for teachers to create a peaceful environment around them? Why is that important?
You can justify it scientifically. Any number of scientific studies have looked at the presence of plants in a classroom and have found that pupils score much better in cognitive tests if they've got a peace palm by the side of them. Now that sounds rather strange, but it is
Isn't that
true.
Amazing? Yes, wonderful.
But nevertheless,
a peace palm.
A peace palm, yes. One of those, for instance.
Here's one I grew earlier.
Here, there's one I grew earlier, indeed. And I have it by the side of my desk here where I'm working. And yes, it's good, but it does cleanse the atmosphere. But don't go too much into that. I think children absorb subconsciously their environment. And if a child is surrounded by chaos and tattiness and graffitied desks and an uncared, unloved for space, that will reflect in their learning process and in how they cope. If, however, they're surrounded by an environment where clearly somebody has cared about the space they come into and therefore cared about them, then again, that can create a very positive environment and a very positive learning outcome for the child and a nice atmosphere in the classroom. Ambient music, perhaps. You can't change heating levels and lighting levels very easily, but you can, with a bit of imagination, as I've pointed out in my book, bring things into the classroom that will help and soothe things. So I think environment is vitally important, and we can still control that to a certain extent or to a very large extent.
Could you talk also about some of the other kind of core techniques that you've suggested in the book? Not necessarily techniques, but ways that people can affect the ambience physiologically or from the heart rate variability perspective. Some of those different strategies that you're suggesting and promoting.
Yes, I think to begin with, teachers and certainly myself have needed over the years a lot of support in understanding how children work. And once we understand how children work, then we can improve that process. And when I say work, I'm talking about how we understand brain development, emotional development, impacts of trauma, and so on. Once we understand something of that, then we can start to bring in such things. You just mentioned then, Andrea, heart rate variability. We have this principle called heart math, which I have used quite a lot with quite difficult children in quite challenging situations, where you can demonstrate to the child that by a certain amount of regular breathing, by positive visualization, you don't say like that to the child, obviously, but by positive visualization, then you can start to take control of your emotional response. That can be done with computer software that goes under the heading of heart math, which blows a lot of kids away. The fact you can connect them to a computer and they can actually see how their breathing and their thinking affects the wave on the screen that shows their heart rate variability, and how it can change from being a spiky mess to a nice, smooth, coherent line in under 5 minutes. It's like, wow, you know, this is good. And this is something that whole schools have practiced in the past without resorting to the software and the technology, but how they have reported that, yes, it does lead to a very positive atmosphere in our school.
So there's something there about the child or the pupils, because it doesn't have to just be children, does it? It could also be young people. So
yes, of course,
pupils being able to, with you or with somebody else in the school environment, being able to learn that actually they can calm themselves to a degree, not to necessarily just, that there's no blame involved with this. This is just offering another tool to support them to be able to regulate, isn't it? Because, and this leads back to the peaceful teachers being able to regulate themselves, but also to support the young people to be able to regulate themselves as well, the pupils.
Indeed.
So, yeah.
When I was working in a multidisciplinary setting in foster care, I introduced heart math to the team I was working with, and they, as adults, found it incredibly useful. One of my colleagues who had suffered from chronic blood pressure for some time actually found his blood pressure was dropping in a way that he could never have dreamed possible. So yes, heart math cuts across both children, young people, and one's colleagues.
And oneself. Definitely.
Yes.
But I think it's, what's interesting about it also is the fact that it is a computer. So for some children that might be more accessible than overly direct contact with an adult. If they don't trust adults,
yes,
they might actually, with the adult alongside, but rather than directly, prefer something like that. So I guess it extends the range of choice, doesn't it?
It does. And obviously we know that from attachment styles, some children will not buy into you as a person, but
Yes.
they will buy into the computer program or something introduced by a third party.
Yes.
Even another child working with them on it can be effective.
Yes, absolutely. So we have to be quite flexible and have a very wide range of tools in the toolbox. From I know in the book you talk about bringing a screwdriver in. I'm not sure, health and safety, good heavens, we have to put up a little alert at this point to make sure that the tables aren't dodgy and so forth. So that physical tool in your toolbox, or a peace palm, but all the way through to being flexible with our attachment for informed, trauma informed approach that says not every way of working is going to work with every child. Some of it may be starting primarily with relationship, but some of it's shared task, isn't it? And heart math on the computer can become a shared task, which is really...
I think we are, as teachers, incredibly powerful. And I think over the last few years, there's been a sense of disempowerment that, oh gosh, it's the national curriculum, it's Ofsted knocking on the door, it's this government initiative and so on. But actually still, as teachers, we can exert an incredible amount of positive power for our children by using this whole range of interventions, and being self-responsible and exercising our own self-stewardship, but then being able to transfer this to the children we teach.
You talked earlier on about becoming interested through the course of your career in working with looked after children or foster children. And I know you're on a fostering panel now.
Yes.
Over time, have you seen the issues changing for children who are now in the care system? Or how do you see the trends in that domain?
I'd like to say that over the last 20 years, that there has been an incredible improvement in outcomes for looked after children and children suffering from trauma. I have to say, in all honesty, I'm still searching for that, because there are still so many barriers these children have to overcome. And teachers do not always receive the support that we need in order to overcome those barriers, which is one of the reasons that took me to writing the book. I realized that you can have any number of bolt-on initiatives, and sooner or later those initiatives tend to drop off. What is important is the human contact these children have, and how that can help alleviate some of their their issues.
Yes, and I think, you know, there's been a lot of research, hasn't there, that says how important it is that even just with one adult can make the difference. And we can but hope that the child is being able to make that relationship with the foster carer, but nonetheless that teacher can play such a crucial role if they can really meet the child and see the child. You obviously feel
Yes.
very passionate about this. Do you want to talk about any personal connection to this world?
Yes, I suppose if one wants to look at things personally, I can say that from my own background, I was adopted at a very early age. And although the adoption went as smooth as it possibly could, then I have come to realize over the years that some of my responses to life situations were deeply rooted in, I suppose, to put it honestly, a sense of rejection. Rejected by my birth mother, though she herself went through absolute hell in this process, as I later on in life came to realize. But that very much was part of my own reaction to children in my early days of teaching. You said, what would I say to the younger Kevin? I said, well, don't take it personally, but also don't take it personally because you feel you are being rejected again. And understand this about yourself, and it makes you a far more effective supporter for children who are going through it themselves. So yes, I do think it's coloured quite a lot of my life subconsciously, and now I realise that I can work with it in a far more positive way.
Well, it's an incredibly positive contribution to make to write a book that's all about school as a secure base, because that secure base where people feel accepted, where they have a sense of belonging and connection, is absolutely the antithesis of rejection, isn't it?
Yes,
so it's a brilliant contribution to be made.
Yes.
Thank you for the work you've done on it. That's
Thank
grand.
you.
But I just want to ask you about the art behind you. Tell us a bit about that side of yourself.
Right, okay. Yes, I've been a frustrated artist for many, many years, and only in the last 10 years have I given myself permission to open up. So there is some priceless artwork on the walls here. So priceless I haven't been able to sell it. But no, I very much now enjoy the process of art. I'm talking to you out of what was my former art studio, but then my canvases grew bigger and this room seemed to grow smaller. So I've now got a studio down in town where I can really splash the paint and fly. But yes, visual art, creativity, writing, poetry have all been a very important part of my life and continue to really sustain and inspire me.
Because a lot of your career was as an English teacher, wasn't it? Not as an art teacher, even though you were head of a creative arts department, but you were often being an English teacher, weren't you?
That's right, yes. And that was one of the things, creative writing with children, I really, really enjoyed. I would never set a class of children a creative writing task unless I could do it myself, and often I wrote alongside them, and whilst they were doing their writing, this was in the days of blackboards. You know, blackboards. No, anyway, just before whiteboards, I would turn the board round so the children couldn't see what I was writing, so I would write something, and then we'd all share our work together. Tremendous fun and very, very interesting. Even reluctant boys, I hate poetry, came to actually find words could work for them.
What's your hope for Peaceful Pupils then? What's your best hope for them if you're standing and seeing a cohort of pupils who could shine with the piece that the teachers have been able to create for them? What's your hope for them?
My hope would be that they can work out of themselves without feeling pressured, without feeling they have to conform to and reflect what they think people want of them in order to be accepted. That they can be free in their thinking, that they can allow their often teenage visions to fly, and they can feel a sense of freedom in themselves rather than a feeling of being repressed, channeled, and knocked into a square box if they themselves were a bit of a round hole.
Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed. I love the fact that in your book, you go from attachment theory and trauma-informed practice right down to a list of peaceful plants.
Yes.
It's a very all-round book in that sense, because you're really wanting to say there are so many dimensions to this thing of generating peace in oneself and
Yes.
generating it externally. I guess what's coming to mind as we're speaking is that thing about the zero tolerance, in the best use of the expression, policy in New York. Do you remember when New York was a terribly dangerous place to live? And then a
Hmm.
mayor came along and said, we're not going to have one broken window. We're not going to have
Yes.
one broken bench. We're going to sort out the windows. We're going to have zero tolerance on that kind of
Zero tolerance.
crisis.
Yes.
Yes, that's healthy zero tolerance to my mind.
Oh, yes.
And it, when you go back to Viktor Frankl, or you go back to some of those early, and the power of now and so on, what you're saying is let's improve now and then generate that out somehow in
Yes.
waves. I just have this image of you wanting people from your book to kind of read all kind of this in many different dimensions of
Yes.
creating that peaceful environment, kind of walking the school from that place to see what could we make, even little differences that could just generate that sense of, I suppose, felt safety and felt sense of being valued.
One school where I was head of faculty, the corridors were bleak, and I suggested we needed to put up notice boards to celebrate children's work. And one or two staff said, wasting your time, wasting your money, the kids will just tear those down as they pass. They didn't. And this was well before I was really consciously working, but something subconsciously was working in me of creating the right environment. And yes, it does ray out into the whole school. How do you conduct break times? What happens in a wet break is very, very important, and really does reflect on the ethos of the school if things are going well. How do you begin the school day and end the school day?
Yes.
As
And you
well
even
as
talk about how do we welcome the pupils into the classroom. You really go
That's
down
right.
to some fine detail here. How can you
Yes.
generate that sense from the get-go of the class?
Yes, very, very important that you can stand at the end of a lesson, and as the pupils leave the lesson, you're standing by the door and perhaps exchanging an odd word with one or two of them and so on, and you're seeing them safely out into the next space. But at the beginning of the day, at the end of the day, these transitions, which for some traumatized children can be horribly painful and scary, you can smooth these transitions for all pupils, and school becomes, yes, a secure base.
Yes. Okay, so finally, just because we are in the summer holidays, talking to each other just
Yes.
before perhaps some schools or more schools or even all schools go back in September, we're not sure yet,
No,
but just
no.
because we are speaking to each other during the time of the coronavirus. I just wondered if you can have any suggestions or thoughts or anything why the book might be helpful just at this particular time to support teachers making their own transition back, and at a time which is scary for a lot of people really. And we know that some children have been champing at the bit to get back, and there's been some experiences of teachers finding children don't want to talk about well-being. Maybe it's a honeymoon phase, or who knows, but we also know that there's been an increase in domestic violence. We know that there's all sorts of stuff been happening behind closed doors. So in this transitional phase, is there anything that you think that people would find particularly helpful and supportive here for going back into schools?
Totally, yes. I think teachers are going to find that when we welcome the children back, hopefully in a positive environment that's not too sterile, then the children themselves will be bringing such a wide variety of anxieties, of understandings, that over the last 4 or 5 months, they have had their view of the world filtered very much through a single source, and that is the family. And as teachers, we're going to have to allow for this. We're going to have to, I think, show even more understanding and more emotional maturity in the way that we deal with such a disparate group of children and young people. And it again, I haven't been, but I could have been shielding. I could have an elderly mother who I visit every week and who I don't want to endanger. And so I'm coming back into a classroom and thinking, oh my God, am I going to pick anything up or not? These are very real fears. They have to be heard, they have to be understood, and they have to be respected. But at the same time, we have to look at the way in which children are reacting themselves, and not, it's asking a lot, but not allow our own fears to intrude, and to allow children to find their feet again. And that for some children will take a long time. We've got to give them time, and we've got to nurture them perhaps more than ever before.
Yeah. And I guess it speaks to what you were saying at the beginning about, you know, back to the Eckhart Tolle thing in terms of, is that how we say his name?
Eckhart Tolle.
Yes, about being in the moment, because what we can't know, we can't assume that there'll be lots of awful things. We can't assume there'll be a honeymoon period and then all hell will break loose. We just can't assume, can we? So
No.
It's something about teachers being able to really find as many supports around them as they can, because it's a very big ask to stay as centered as possible in their own experience, and being it in order to be able to be free to meet it, because they're going to need a lot of support too. It feels like the wider community needs to support the teachers to support the children and young people. So
yes, it is these concentric circles that move out and out and out, and each one has its own very important input to make into what's going on in the dead center, where, to come back to the book again, we have peaceful teachers right in the center here, surrounded by these circles of other support.
Yes. So just as with the adults looking after the most traumatized children, with the foster carers and the adoptive parents and so forth, they need lots of support, but
Indeed.
teachers do too, to generate that. So thank you so much, Kevin. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for writing this book. And do you have you got a whole stack of books beside your bed at the moment? Are you a great book reader still and now?
Yes. Since asked, I was talking to a friend the other day, and he'd bought me some old Resurgence magazines to read, and said, oh, thanks, Tony, that's great. This is what I'm reading at the moment. And there was a book on William Blake, there was Bill Bryson's book on the human body, there was a book on some aspect of cognitive thinking, there was an Alexander McCall Smith lightweight one, and there was, I'm going back through Eckhart Tolle again. So I've got about 5 books on the go at the moment.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for adding to our libraries as well, and thank you for speaking with me this morning. Thanks so much then. You take care.
Okay, thank you, Andrea. Thank you.